The last thing Elam Sturgill ever did was set his snowshoes down in the middle of an open mountainside. Neat, upright, side by side, the way a man leaves his shoes at a threshold when he means to step inside somewhere warm. There was no threshold there. There was no door, no wall, no structure of any kind within half a mile in any direction. Just open slope, buried timber, and white silence going on forever. The men who found those shoes a week later, after the snow had settled enough to permit movement, stood around them without speaking for a long time. Because speaking required choosing a word for what they were looking at. And the only word that fit was the one none of them were willing to say out loud. His tracks came up the hollow and arrived at those shoes and stopped. Nothing went forward. Nothing went back. He had been there, and then he had not. And whatever came next had left no record in the snow. Up on Burnt Ridge, behind a door she had not opened, a woman heard his voice that same night, made the decision that saved her life. This is the story of what she knew that Elam did not. About the 2 winters of quiet, terrible education that had prepared her for the one night that mattered. About the thing that moves through the deep Appalachian winters. Not as a beast, not as a ghost, but as something far more patient and far more dangerous than either. That finds the people you love most and wears them the way a hunter wears a blind, and comes to your door in their voice, warm and desperate and completely familiar, asking only that you slide the bar and let it in. About what happens when you refuse, and about what it takes with it when it leaves. Her name was Mahala Holloway, 51 years old, in December of 1888. Taller than most men in that valley, with a blacksmith's ruined hands and a blacksmith's dead husband and 2 years of strange nights already behind her before the worst night of her life arrived. She had been expecting it, not dreading it, expecting it. The way a soldier who has studied the terrain expects the ambush, without illusion and without panic. Because expectation is the only preparation available to someone who cannot run. Her dying husband had told her it was coming. With the last organized thought he possessed, he had told her what to do. Not how to fight it, not how to flee, how to keep it out. Iron. Over every door, at every window, at every place where the world outside pressed against the world inside. Iron. Because whatever this thing was, iron was the one language it could not argue with. What came to her cabin that December night did not arrive as a monster. Monsters are manageable. You can identify a monster, name it, brace against it. What came to Burnt Ridge came as the people she missed most in the world. It came in her dead husband's voice, saying her name in the dark, the way he said it when he wanted her to come to bed. Warm, low, 29 years of marriage compressed into a single syllable. It came as the voice of her closest friend, a decent and good man who had walked through a killing blizzard to bring her coffee and lamp oil, who had never once in his life asked her for anything. Now begging, now weeping, asking whether her friendship meant nothing. It used love as a key. It used grief as a crowbar. And in doing so, it made one mistake. The kind only something ancient and utterly certain of itself would make. It showed her, precisely and without meaning to, what it was. She did not open the door. That is the whole miracle and the whole horror of it, contained in one sentence. She did not open the door. But Elam Sturgill had no door to not open. He had only the open mountain and the dark and the storm, and something that found him in it, and what I have to tell you, about what that thing left behind, about what it took, about what a county clerk wrote in a shaking hand at the bottom of the last page of this account. That is what you are here for. Keep the lights where you want them. And understand, before we begin, that what walked Burnt Ridge that winter did not stop walking when the blizzard cleared. The hard winters still come, and on an old house, on a door frame you have passed 100 times without looking closely, there is a piece of iron that someone put there for a reason no one alive remembers. No one except whatever made them put it there. I want to tell you something before this begins. What you are about to hear is not a story I invented. It is a story I found in county records, in a deposition written by a clerk whose handwriting deteriorates visibly across 2 pages, in weather logs from an Appalachian winter that by any meteorological account should not have been as severe as everyone who survived it described. I do not come to you with theater. I come with documents, and with the particular kind of dread that only documents produce. Because fiction you can close. A ledger entry in a dead man's ink does not close. The account of Mahala Holloway and the winter of 1888 sat in a county archive largely undisturbed for over 100 years. When I first read it, I read it twice before I put it down. The second time, I noticed what the first reading had hurried past in its rush toward the horror, which is that what Mahala did, by instinct and by her dead husband's instruction, maps with exact and unnerving precision onto something the Apostle Paul wrote nearly 2,000 years ago. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, Paul told the Ephesians, but against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Mahala Holloway could not have quoted that verse by chapter and number, but she was living it. Passage by passage, in the dark, with iron between her and the thing testing it. And the scripture and the metal meant the same thing in that moment. That there are forces in this world that cannot be outrun or reasoned with, only held at. I am telling you this story completely tonight, the way it has never quite been told before. If you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell. What I do on this channel is exactly this. Find the accounts that courthouse records tried to leave unfiled and tell them to you straight, without softening the edges or resolving what was never resolved. Leave me one thing in the comments: where you are watching from tonight, city and country, whatever you are comfortable sharing. I read every one. There is something I cannot fully explain about knowing who is out there in the quiet with me while I tell these things. You are not as alone right now as the dark around you suggests. Now, let us go up the mountain. What the Holloways knew that nobody else did. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not travel well through time. Not because it is complicated, it is usually very simple. A handful of words, a specific action, a material kept in a specific place for a specific reason. It does not travel well because the reason always sounds. To the generation that did not earn it the hard way, like superstition. And superstition, in the ordinary light of an ordinary day, is embarrassing in a way that danger is not. So the knowledge gets shortened. The reason gets dropped. What survives is the action without the why. Iron over a door becomes something you do because your grandmother did it, not because you remember what your grandmother was keeping out. And then, one winter, the hard winter, the thing the iron was holding back arrives at the door of someone who let the iron come down, and the education begins again. The Holloways had not let it come down. In 2 generations on this continent, across 2 states and 4 homesteads, not a single Holloway had removed the iron from a threshold without replacing it before nightfall. This was not piety, it was memory. They were Pennsylvania Germans 2 generations removed, who had rolled down the long wagon road into the Appalachian highlands, with an anvil in the wagon bed, and the old country knowledge still fresh enough to use. They had come from a place where the memory was short enough to still be accurate, where grandmothers told daughters and daughters told daughters that certain things move through this world in the cold seasons, particularly the coldest seasons, that are neither ghost nor beast, but something with considerably more patience and considerably more intelligence than either. These things cannot cross a threshold guarded by iron. They cannot argue with it, find the crack in it, or wait it out. Iron stops them the way a wall stops a man. They can stand at the boundary for as long as the night holds, but they cannot come through. The Holloways kept iron over every door they had ever owned on 2 continents. It was as ordinary to them as keeping salt in a salt box. Mahala Holloway, last blacksmith of that line, who had married Mahala Khan of Cold Spring Hollow when they were both still young, told her about it the way a man tells a woman the strange things about his family before she is committed to living with them. He told it with a slight, apologetic tilt to his voice, as if he expected her to find it ridiculous. She laughed. He laughed. And then he kept every piece of iron in every position his grandmother had specified. For the next 29 years, because whatever his wife thought of it, and whatever he allowed himself to say about it in daylight, he had not forgotten what the iron was for. Some knowledge is too expensive to learn twice. What Adler knew, and what his grandmother's grandmother had known, and what the Apostle Paul had understood when he warned the Ephesians about principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world, is that certain battles are not fought in the open field. They are fought at thresholds, at the exact place where inside meets outside, where the warmth you have built and the cold that surrounds it share nothing but a wall of wood and iron and will. The fight is not always dramatic. It does not always announce itself with noise and spectacle. Sometimes it is nothing more than a latched door and the decision not to open it. The most mundane heroism the world produces, and also, on the right night, the most necessary kind. Adler died in the autumn of 1886, taken by a fever that moved through him in 3 days and left nothing worth arguing with. There was no doctor within half a day's ride. The rain had rendered the low road impassable, so Mahala sat up with him alone through the final night. And somewhere in the small hours, when the fever had taken his clarity but not yet his voice, Adler began speaking in a low and steady tone. The voice of a man settling accounts before a journey he cannot postpone. "Keep the iron up," he told her. "Every piece. No matter who comes up the hollow calling it foolishness, no matter what the preacher says about heathen custom, no matter how many quiet winters pass without incident, keep it up. The quiet winters are easy. You keep the iron up for the hard winter. And you will know the hard winter when it comes, because the hard winter is the one where the snow shuts every door in the valley." She asked him what came in the hard winters. He did not answer that. He had already gone somewhere she could not follow. But just before the gray light came through the window, with the last organized sentence left in him, he said, "When the snow shuts every door in the valley, the only door that matters is the one you don't open." Then he was gone, and the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms are quiet only after something has left them that was never going to come back. Mahala sat with his hand in hers until the gray became full light. Then she went to the lean-to, lit the forge, and got to work, because she was the kind of woman who, when handed the most important instructions of her life, acted on them before the grief had time to reason her out of them. What 2 winters taught her before the third one arrived. The valley below Burnt Ridge formed an opinion of Mahala Holloway over the 2 years following Adler's death. And the opinion was shaped entirely by what they could see from the outside, which was a tall, gray-haired woman with burned hands who had nailed iron crosses over every surface of her property, who no longer came to Sunday meeting, who answered the door civil enough when you knocked but never once asked you past it. The opinion they settled on was grief. Grief was the explanation that required the least imagination and the least revision of what they believed about the world. A woman alone on a mountain after 29 years of marriage has every right to go a little strange. Give her time. She will come around or she will not. But either way, it will run its course. They were not entirely wrong about the grief. They were catastrophically wrong about what the grief had made her. Mahala worked the forge with hands that had watched Adler work it for nearly 3 decades and absorbed more than she had consciously known. She made crosses, palm-sized, 2 flat bars of iron beaten together, the ends turned down into hooks for nailing. She blackened them in the coals and hung them everywhere. The door of the cabin, both windows, the spring house, the smokehouse, the 4 compass points of the well. By the end of the first winter, she had made 3 dozen. By the end of the second, twice that. The cabin bristled with them from the eaves to the foundation stones. When the mail carrier Pruitt saw it coming up the hollow on his rounds, he described it in the store at Cinder Gap with the bewildered accuracy of a man cataloging something he has no category for. The preacher came once, a thin, dry man named Asahel Crane, who had strong convictions about the boundary between faith and what he called heathen foolishness, and who had decided that iron crosses nailed over a spring-house door fell clearly on the wrong side of it. He rode up the hollow one spring afternoon to set Mahala right. He came back down considerably quieter than he had gone up. He never said what passed between them. He never returned. And this became the valley's settled portrait of her. Queer with grief, unreachable, not to be reasoned with, and therefore not to be concerned with. What the valley did not know is that the iron was already being tested. The first winter brought small things, the kind a woman alone on a mountain at the edge of grief can still fold into an ordinary explanation if she works at it. A January morning when the snow around the cabin was unbroken in every direction, smooth as a held breath, except for a single line of tracks that came down off the ridge, crossed the yard, and stopped. Not at the door. 1 precise pace short of the iron laid along the threshold, as if whatever made them had arrived, measured the distance, and concluded this particular threshold was not available tonight. She told herself bare. She worked at the telling until it held. The second winter, things came that no amount of working would hold together. A night in deep February, when the old hound threw itself against the inside of the door with the specific desperation of an animal that believes something is about to end, and then went silent. Not gradually. The way a lamp goes out, completely, instantly, as if the baying had been a flame and something had simply removed the air from around it. In the silence after, she heard footsteps outside. Slow, measured, unhurried, a man pacing off the perimeter of a property he is considering purchasing, making his circuit with the patience of someone in no hurry whatsoever. She counted 11 full revolutions of the cabin before the steps paused beneath the south window. Then her dead husband said her name, not called it. Said it at the particular low, warm pitch he used when he wanted her to leave off whatever work had kept her up past a reasonable hour. Mahala, the sound of 29 years of evenings pressed into a single syllable. She lay in the dark with the quilt at her chin and her eyes open and her hands flat against the mattress. and she did not answer, and she did not move. She lay there until the gray light came. Then she dressed, went outside, and found the tracks beneath the south window. The iron cross above it was furred with frost on a morning too mild to have produced any. White and thick on the outside of the glass. Cold applied deliberately, from the inside out. She stood there with her fingers touching the furred metal and felt, for the first time, not fear, but something colder and more useful than fear. She felt certainty. She went back into the cabin, stood at the forge with her hands on the edge of the anvil, breathing the coal smell, feeling the metal under her palms. Then she lit the coals and made more iron. The hard winter had not come yet, but she understood now. With the clarity of someone who has touched the evidence with her own fingers, that it was coming, and she would not be caught short. How the mountain sealed itself and what that released. The autumn of 1888 did not arrive so much as it descended. A sudden stripping of the forest in a single week of October. Brown and curling leaves coming down all at once across the ridge, as if the trees had made a collective decision overnight and carried it out before dawn. Not the slow, melancholy loosening of a normal fall. A decision. The geese left nearly a month early, flying low and fast and without their usual circling, as if they had calculated the distance and wanted no further argument with the sky above those mountains. Pruitt, the mail carrier, who had tracked the natural signs of that country for 40 years as a more reliable forecast than any almanac, told everyone who came into his store that the woolly worms were black from end to end, and the hornets had built their nests close to the ground. A low nest, in the mountain understanding, means the snow intends to meet you on your own level. People laughed at Pruitt the way people always laugh at the man who remembers the last time. He had been laughed at before. He let them finish. The first snow came the 8th of December and did not melt. The second came 6 days later and lay 2 feet over the first. By Christmas, the road to Cinder Gap had not merely drifted over. It had ceased to exist as a visible feature of the landscape. The valley floor was a single featureless white plain with no edge and no direction. And the gap itself was a smudge of chimney smoke in a white that went from ridge to ridge, without offering the eye a single place to rest. Men dug from house to barn and called it sufficient. The mail had not come in 3 weeks. Nothing had come in 3 weeks. On Burnt Ridge, Mahala Holloway watched the sky the way you watch the face of someone you have known long enough to read past what they are showing you. And she understood, in the marrow of her, what Adler had meant. The snow that shuts every door in the valley. This was it. Not one of the hard winters. The hard winter, the one he had spent his last breath naming. She made ready with the particular, unhurried efficiency of a woman who has been preparing for a specific thing for 2 years and feels, in some cold and sober way, relieved that it has finally come. She brought the dog inside and blocked the dog door. She filled the wood box until the lid barely closed, then stacked more wood just inside the cabin door. Because she had a settled certainty, not panic, more like a navigator's knowledge of terrain, that she did not want to be outside this cabin after dark, once the real weather descended. She trimmed the lantern wick, verified her oil, salted what remained of the smoked meat, and latched the smokehouse hard. Then she went around the full perimeter, cabin, springhouse, smokehouse, all 4 posts of the well, and pressed each iron cross with her thumb, checking the nails bite in the wood, checking that nothing had worked loose in the freeze and thaw of the weeks before. Most held solid. One cross at the springhouse had shifted a fraction. She drove it back with a hammer and held her hand on the wood afterward, feeling the cold of the metal through her palm, and thought one word: hold. She stood in the gray afternoon and looked up at the notch in the ridgeline where the wind came through. And she had a thought she carried the rest of her life. She thought that she would have given a great deal to know what was up there in that notch, looking back down at her. Because something was. She was certain of it, the way you are certain of being watched. Without evidence, without logic, with only the back of the neck and the specific quality of the silence. Down at the mouth of Cold Spring Hollow, Elam Sturgill smelled the blizzard coming with the instinct of a man who has spent his adult life reading a mountain the way other men read books. That flat iron pressure in the air, the particular quality of a quiet that is not peaceful, but coiled. He stood on his porch and looked up toward Burnt Ridge. He was not a superstitious man. He had never been convinced by the iron crosses, not in the daylight part of himself that ran his trap lines and knew this country better than he knew his own kitchen floor. But he believed in Mahala, and he believed in the storm. And he believed that a woman alone at the top of a hollow that was about to close for a week or more deserved not to be alone in it. So Elam Sturgill loaded a pack with coffee, cornmeal, a side of bacon, and a fresh canister of lamp oil. He strapped on his snowshoes. He left a note on his table in case anyone came looking. He stepped off his porch and started up into the throat of what was coming, because he was the kind of man who walks toward things rather than away from them, which is an admirable quality, and which on this particular evening was the last free decision he would ever make. The blizzard came on him midway up the hollow, not building the way a reasonable storm builds, but arriving all at once, the light going out of the world between one snowshoe stride and the next. Wind standing the snow sideways. The cold passing through his coat as if the coat were a suggestion the temperature had declined to honor. He was turned around within an hour, in country he had walked 1,000 times, unable to find north, unable to find the hollow, unable to see the timber or his own hand at arm's length. He kept moving because to stop was to freeze. The slope kept rising, and he followed it because up was where the cabin was. And the cabin was the only thought he had left that organized itself into a sentence. It was full dark by the time Mahala heard the knock at her door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and a voice she recognized. What came to every door and window. She had been sitting close to the stove with the lantern turned low and the dog's weight across her feet, listening, not to the wind. She had made her peace with the wind's voice hours ago, the long moan of it in the chimney, the hiss at the window seams. She was listening to what moved beneath the wind's voice. Something in that storm had a register the storm itself did not. A low pressure at the edge of words. The way a river will briefly form itself into syllables before the current shifts and the sound returns to being only water. She had put her hands over her ears once and removed them again, because not hearing it was worse than hearing it. At least when you can hear a thing, you know where it is. 3 knocks at the door. Slow, spaced like a man too cold to be urgent. Then Elam Sturgill's voice, hoarse, cracking, saying her name and saying for God's sake and saying let me in. And understand what those words cost her to not act on. Elam was the one person in the entire valley who had treated her, consistently without condescension, as a woman in full possession of her mind. The relief that moved through her at the sound of his voice was the relief of a person who has been frightened and alone for a long time, and suddenly believes they are neither. Her hand went to the bar across the door. Her fingers closed on the wood. She stopped. She made herself stop. Not in the panicked way of someone suppressing an impulse, but deliberately. the way a surgeon makes herself look at the thing before she cuts. She made herself remember the second winter, the voice under the south window, the specific, terrible warmth of it. And she made herself remember Adler's words, that whatever walked the hard winters could not cross a guarded threshold of its own will, but that it could come through any door a living person opened from the inside. It did not force, it invited. And the invitation it used was the voice of whoever you loved most in the world. She did not lift the bar. She pressed her mouth to the wood and spoke with a steadiness that cost her more than she had ever spent on any single thing. Elam, if it is truly you, you will not mind standing one more moment in the cold. There is iron at this threshold. Step over it and come into the fire. Step over the iron, and I will open the door. Silence. The specific texture of a silence that is not empty but occupied. The silence of something recalibrating. When the voice returned, it had changed. Not entirely, not in a way she could have named precisely. The way a musical note changes when the instrument playing it is structurally wrong. Mahala, it said. Beneath the cold and the exhaustion, something had slipped. An edge that did not belong in Elam's throat. An urgency that did not fit the man she knew. I am frozen near to dying out here, and you want me to play games on your doorstep. Open the door. Open it now. She said, I cannot. God forgive me. Not until you have crossed the iron. What came out of the storm then was a sound she spent years trying to describe to the clerk who took her account. And she never fully succeeded. It occupied a register between human voice and wind that the ear is not built to accommodate, arriving not through the ears, but somewhere behind them, in the part of the skull where language is recognized and processed, scrambling something there. The clerk wrote in the margin. She went very pale here and asked to stop for a moment. He gave her water. Then she continued. The thing began to walk. Round the cabin, slow, unhurried. The measured pace of something with neither cold to fear nor deadline to keep. At the east window, it was Elam again, weeping now, naming every cord of wood he had ever split for her, every trip down to Pruitt's store, every winter he had come up the hollow just to make sure she was still breathing. So exactly the voice of a decent man bewildered by rejection that Mahala pressed her fist against her mouth until she tasted blood. She did not open the window. At the south window, she nearly broke. The south window was the window of the room where she slept, where Adler had slept beside her. And the voice at the south window was his, not an approximation, his, Mahala, warm, low, the exact weight he gave it. 29 years of evenings in a single word. Sweetheart, leave off your work now. Let me come home. I've been so cold, out here so long. You don't know how long. Just lift the one piece of iron over this window, love. Just the one. She wanted to. She will not lie about that in the account she later gave. The wanting was not a small thing she could reason past. It was a collapse behind the breastbone. Physical, total. And what terrified her most was not the voice. It was how precisely it knew her. It had not copied Adler's sound. It had reached down into the exact shape of the absence he had left, and poured itself into that shape with something that felt, God help her, indistinguishable from tenderness. Her own love, turned back against her, used as a key in a lock, grief had left open. She put both palms flat against the log wall beneath the window. She spoke in a whisper, but with the weight of a sentence arrived at through the hardest possible route, and therefore immovable. My Adler told me on his dying night to keep the iron up. And whatever you are, you have just proved he was right. Because my Adler would never, in this life or out of it, ask me to take it down. The voice did not answer. The frost came instead, a slow crackle moving up the inside of the glass, deliberate, as if cold were being applied from the outside with intention. By morning, that window would be furred white on the inside, with ice an inch thick. The iron cross above it encased in a shell so solid it rang like a bell when she struck it. The thing circled the cabin all that long night. It tried every threshold, every window, every outbuilding. It tried voices she half knew and voices she had never heard, all of them saying her name with the intimacy of something that had been watching long enough to understand what her name meant to her. Before dawn, she stopped listening to the words entirely. She kept her hands on the bar and waited for the light, the way a sailor waits for a shore he can hear but cannot yet see. Not certain, not peaceful, only committed. It is what Paul meant by the armor of God. Not a metaphor, not a comfort. A decision held under sustained and intelligent pressure until the darkness runs out of night. She held all the long hours until the light, the morning account, and the question that has no answer. The light came just after dawn, the way it always comes, not kindly, not dramatically, but reliably, which is the only form of mercy that can be trusted without reservation. The wind dropped without warning, as if someone had closed a valve. The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the lantern flame moving in still air. She waited a full hour before she touched the bar. Not caution exactly. More like the understanding of someone who has spent a long night learning exactly what she was dealing with and intends not to become careless at the last moment. She dug the door open through the snow banked against it and stepped out into a morning that hit her eyes like a physical blow. White light in every direction, the mountain remade into something that had never been touched. She stood on her threshold with one hand on the door frame and looked at what the night had left. The tracks ringed the cabin in a path beaten so deep and so many times over that the snow was packed hard as a threshing floor. Not the result of hours. Days of steady traffic could not have produced it more thoroughly. They ran to every window and stood beneath each in a zone of disturbed, compressed snow that told of long waiting, the waiting of something with no reason to hurry. They ran to the springhouse, the smokehouse, each post of the well. At every single threshold, every door, every window, every place where Mahala Holloway's iron crossed the boundary between outside and inside. The track stopped, not drifted away, not lost interest. Stopped, a precise and consistent distance short of the iron, as if the iron were a wall made of something the tracks could perceive and measure with accuracy, but could not breach. Like a river against a mountain. Not one track had crossed a line of iron. Not one in the entire circuit of the cabin and every outbuilding on the property. Mahala looked at the tracks for a long time. Then she went inside and barred the door in broad daylight. She did not come out for 3 days. The clerk who later took her account recorded that she described the track's pattern in precise detail, the spacing, the depth, the distribution around each threshold, and then declined to describe what had made them, saying only that she had lived on that mountain her entire life and knew every print that any living thing leaves in the snow of those highlands, and that these were not among them. In the margin of the page, in slightly different ink, the clerk drew them. That drawing exists in the archive. I will leave it there. Some images should be found, not described. The men from Cinder Gap came up the hollow a week later. when the snow had settled enough to permit movement. Pruitt at the head, 6 men behind him, all wearing the careful expressions of people who have agreed in advance not to say anything they cannot take back. They were looking for Elam Sturgill. They followed the hollow up the way a man on snowshoes would have gone. And partway up, where the timber thinned and the slope opened, they found his snowshoes, standing upright, side by side, neat, patient. The way a man leaves his shoes at a threshold when he has stepped inside and means to come back out. There was no threshold, no door, no wall, nothing built by human hands within half a mile in any direction. Only the open slope, the buried timber, and the white silence of a mountain that had taken a man and showed nothing on its surface. No tracks led away from the snowshoes. None. His tracks came up the hollow, arrived at those shoes, and simply ceased. The way a sentence ends at a period, completely and without remainder. The men stood around those 2 upright snowshoes in silence. Nobody said the thing they were all thinking, because the thing they were all thinking was not available in the vocabulary of men who had to go home afterward and sleep in their own beds. They said bear. They said he went down a draw. They said these things happened to better woodsmen than Elam, which was true and was also not the truth. And every man in the party understood the difference and chose the version he could live inside. Except Pruitt. Pruitt stood at those snowshoes longer than any of the others, looking at the neatness of them, the deliberateness of 2 objects set down by someone who intended to retrieve them from the other side of a door. He turned and walked back down without speaking. When he reached his store, he walked directly to the door and took down the iron horseshoe that had hung over it for 30 years, which everyone, including himself, had always called decoration. He looked at it for a moment. Then he drove it back in place, points up, the way the old people said held the luck from running out, and made 4 more before the week was out. He was not the only man in Cinder Gap who did the same that spring. Nobody announced it. The believing was too large and too specific to be spoken. It just appeared, in iron, over doors, in the weeks after the snow went off and the full accounting of that winter was made. Now here is what I have been saving for you. Here is the detail that nobody in that valley looked at directly, because looking at it directly required accepting what it meant. When the thing came to Mahala's door in Elam Sturgill's voice, when it wept at the east window in his voice, named his kindnesses in his voice, spoke with the specific cadence and decency of a man she had known for years. It was not guessing. It was not approximating. Mahala knew Elam well enough to recognize the precise music of him, the weight he put on certain words, the particular way a good and plain-spoken man sounds when he is in distress. And what she heard at that door and that window was not like him. It was him. The way the voice at the south window was Adler, not imitation, but the thing itself, taken, worn, used as a garment. The creature had something of Elam Sturgill with it when it came down off that mountain. Out there in the hollow, in the dark, in the blizzard, somewhere between the place where his tracks stopped and the place where his snowshoes stood upright in the open snow, like a patient pair of shoes left at a threshold that was not there. Something had happened to Elam. And what remained of him, whatever a voice carries of a person, whatever leaves the record of someone in the grain of the way they say your name, came to Mahala's door that night. She heard it weeping in the cold. She heard it begging by the name of their friendship. And she left it out there, because her dead husband had told her to, and because, though she would never say this to anyone who had not already earned the right to hear it, She knew that whatever was wearing Elam's voice was not Elam anymore. Elam was already somewhere else. Elam was already gone. You can still find the iron on the old houses in those hollows. Not on every house. The newer ones, built by people whose grandparents forgot the why, have nothing over their doors but paint and time. But on the old ones, the ones with hand-hewn sills and stone foundations and logs cut before anyone alive was born, if you look at the right height, at the right angle, when the afternoon light comes low and catches metal from the side, you will find them, small dark crosses, hand-beaten, nailed with a deliberateness that has outlasted every hand that put them there. Nobody who lives in those houses can tell you why they are there. They will say, decoration. They are not lying. They have simply inherited the action without the reason, the way every generation inherits the things that kept the previous one alive, without being told what the things were defending against. The knowledge of the why was lost. The iron was not. The winter was not lost either. It comes back. The hard winter. The one where the snow shuts every door in the valley. Where a man alone on a mountain slope is alone in a way the word alone was not built to hold. It comes back in every generation, and the thing that walked Burnt Ridge in Elam Sturgill's voice, and Mahala Holloway's voice, and every other voice it had collected across however many winters it had been walking. That thing is patient in a way that makes human patience look like impatience. It does not age. It does not forget. It still knows your name. It still knows the voice of whoever you loved most, and it still cannot cross iron. So the next time you pass an old house, on an old road, at the end of a season that felt wrong in the way only certain autumns feel wrong, look at the door frame. Look at the lintel. Look for the iron that someone put there long before you arrived. For a reason they did not feel they needed to explain, because the reason had explained itself to them personally, on a long night, in the voice of someone they loved. If the iron is there, leave it. Leave it exactly where it is. And if it is missing, if the old thresholds have been cleared and painted over and made clean and modern and free of everything the previous owners kept there for reasons nobody remembers, then you should know what you are sleeping inside. A door without iron is an invitation. And what walks the hard winters has been accepting invitations since before the first nail was ever driven into the first lintel on this continent. Elam Sturgill set his snowshoes down in the open snow and stepped across a threshold that was not there. And he never came back. Keep the iron up.